All right. And we're back for the periodic random walk interview series. I have with me, and I'm very happy to have with me, Professor Garett Jones. I'm just going to read his bio, which doesn't really do Professor Jones or Mr. Jones. I feel like one is Indiana Jones, but justice. But Garett Jones is an associate professor of economics at George Mason. He is the author of 10% Less Democracy, Hive Mind, and the book that I principally want to talk about, the cultural transplant, how migrants make the economies they move to a lot like the ones they left, as well as wine connoisseur, former LDS, lots of things that we could possibly talk about. But anyway, hello, how are you?
Hey, thanks for having me. Great. I'm doing great.
Good. Okay, so just to dive in, why did you write this book? And I guess while you're articulating that, maybe try to lay out the central claim so I don't have to.
Yeah. So my book is about what the subtitle says. It's about how full assimilation is a myth. Immigrants don't assimilate to the countries they move to on average, outside of some superficial ways like language and whatnot. But whether we look over the past 5 centuries and look at how Europeans moved to the Americas in a quite violent ways and changed institutions and remade the Americas in the image of Europe, or whether we look at the Chinese diaspora and they're migrating from China to across Southeast Asia and becoming market dominant minorities, and again, thank goodness, failing to assimilate. There's just been this continuous pattern of migrants making the countries they move to a lot like the ones they left. And that's something that my fellow academics sort of know on some level. We have a lot of other pieces of evidence that point in that direction, but none of us write about it for the normies, for the popular audiences, to let people know. There's a huge academic literature on this, and yet somehow that academic literature never permeates the public consciousness. So I thought it was time for me to write a book that let basically the general public know something that academics have known for many years, that full assimilation is a myth, that culture transplants are real.
So, but I guess I want to push back on that because, to me, you refer to it as it being something that normies don't know about, but it seems axiomatic, right? Like Italians bring Italian food. We've seen the West Side Story, The Godfather, Gangs of New York, right? Like why is it controversial that different immigrants bring their culture with them? In fact, it's celebrated, right?
Yeah, so people celebrate it in when it comes to things like, say, food or clothing, but when it comes to economic productivity, to voting behavior, then it's something you're really not supposed to talk about. And the reason why is that people are worried that people who come from poorer countries will make the richer countries they move to a lot like the poorer countries. So you'll notice that the examples I gave were intentionally chosen. I picked Europeans and Chinese migrants, and in both cases, it was people coming from places and bringing high productivity, greater levels of job creation, and higher wages on average compared to what you'd expect to be the alternative. So, of course, the concern is that the opposite can happen, is that if you bring in people who come from poorer countries, they might make your country poor, not just through arithmetic, not just because they themselves will earn less, but because they might vote in ways that bring the institutions of their old country to the new country. So to give a simple example, suppose just purely hypothetically, that people who come from poor countries that are highly corrupt might bring some of that corruption to the new country they move to. This is, of course, a subplot of The Godfather, right?
Sure.
And it's okay to sort of laugh about it when it comes to The Godfather. But when it happens on a much larger scale, one might worry, if people come from a lot of corrupt countries where helping your buddies out is better than following the neutral rule of law. If that happens on a wide scale, we could become a whole country of people who just help their buddies out rather than follow the rule of law. And that's something that's well worth reflecting upon.
Right. So we'll get back. So I guess, just to the point is right. It's not just, it's cultural transplant doesn't just happen in only the favorable ways. Like most things are always
exactly
right. You get delicious food, but you might also get Casa Nostra and things like that. But or you might get astrophysicists, but you also might get very high neuroticism and bad Woody Allen movies or something like that. it cuts all different directions. But like, so even just focusing, and I'll sort of want to come back to, I guess, drill down specifically what some of those trade-offs might be, or at least if you are trying to be selective, what are you selecting for? What factors that matter? But even on the on the question of like the mafia, or like the early 20th century or late 19th century sort of period, like isn't the argument, the expression that I've heard that I like, in up and out, right? Sort of, you see this migration pattern that happens in cities. Migrants, they come into cities, they move up socioeconomically, then they push out, to the suburbs, and that process, it takes a little bit of time. But like, couldn't you argue that those periods that we remember in Hollywood, whether it's the mafia or gangs of New York, so, that kind of ethnic fight, like okay, it happens, but then people gel, and it's part of the process of upward mobility.
Well, we have a lot of data with pretty good evidence when it comes to second generation migrants that doesn't really happen very much. And part of the reason second generation migrants are particularly interesting is because they're people who are born in the US. But fortunately, when they participate in survey projects, they often are asked the question, where were your parents born? Right? So it turns out that there's a new American savings survey where they ask Americans not just how much do you save and what do you save in, and is it a 401k or an IRA, and how much. They also ask, where were your parents born? And so that's a way to check and see if in the second generation, migrants who come from high savings rate countries save the same as migrants who come from low savings rate countries. And there it's really clear. No, it's not true. People actually import, on average, the attitudes towards savings, toward frugality, toward giving thought for the morrow that exist on average in their home countries. Of course, there are many exceptions. Everybody's an exception to the rule, whatever. We can still generalize. And the generalization is robust. So this kind of study one reason I like to mention savings rates is because nobody can wiggle their way out of it. Nobody can say savings rates are just an opinion, right? How much you decide to put away for the future versus how much you spend now matters for the economy because it helps make more capital available. It's probably a symbol of your foresightedness and your planning behavior in other areas of your life. Economists are used to thinking of patience or rates of time preference as being a sort of a general factor that spans across a lot of your life. It's really important. And so people are bringing, on average, the savings rate of the countries they come from and bringing that here, so lasting at least the second generation. We have other studies that use slightly different measures that look at migrants to the UK and migrants to Germany from multiple countries. They get the same answer. People import their savings rates. That's just one example. But to just give a quick example for the audience, it's been checked on a lot of other issues. But knowing that people don't assimilate in that second generation is a good way to start thinking about the future.
Okay, so all right, so the argument, I guess, is like there are that some of these cultural factors appear to be sticky, and they can't otherwise necessarily be explained. I mean, maybe they can. I guess they can't. Let's put causation for, or at least why they happen to be sticky aside for a moment. So when it, I guess, so going back, so what are the factors? We talk about generally about prosperity, that that there are consequences, that we ought to be thoughtful when it comes, if it's true that the sort of culture is transplanted, then we ought to be thoughtful about what kind of culture that we're transplanting. So like what are, I guess, what are the factors that you're looking to select? I think you mentioned the 3 Ps at one point. What are the 3 Ps?
Oh, so that's in my first book. So I'm talking about the traits that predict cooperation or group cooperation, which is part of building, I think, long-run social capital in your country. When it comes to cooperation settings where people can either cooperate or betray each other, where they're playing the same game over a period of time, I'm thinking of the game, The Prisoner's Dilemma. But more generally, I'm thinking about social settings where teams of people need to work together on a task, and people can sort of, as in a school project, as in a school group homework project, you can either chip in or you can just let it slide. You can either work or you can shirk. And one thing that predicts whether groups of people cooperate in settings where the game is repeated, where they're seeing the same people day in and day out, is first whether they're patient. That's the first P. Second, whether they're perceptive, whether they sort of pay attention to the rules of the game. And third, whether they're pleasant, whether they start off nice. So it turns out that people who do better on IQ tests, for instance, are more likely to do some version of all 3. more patient, more perceptive, and they're more likely to start off nice. It's not that smarter people are nicer, it's they're more willing to sort of take a chance on niceness one way or the other. And that's probably important for getting big group tasks done. And when we think about what helps build a modern economy where we're dealing with these complicated multi-step processes that involve large groups of people getting something done, you want people who are going to like keep an eye on things even when nobody's watching. And finding people who sort of have a sort of moderate pro-social attitude is important for helping to take on the big team efforts that are part of a high productivity economy.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, and I'm jumping around a little bit, but like going
Mhm.
back to this to where you started, where it's just like this is a thing that people know and accept to be true, but on the other hand, in other contexts, it's almost verboten to mention, that cultural there is cultural transfer when we like it, when it's good, but in the specific context of immigration, we don't want to talk about it. But like in any other context, like a firm context, a university, not for profit, social club, like people are love to talk about the unique culture of their institution, of the people around them, that they're extremely selective for it, and they have processes in place to ensure that you know that newcomers are vetted and trained for it. So I guess why do you like that? Seems to be very well accepted and important. I mean, you could
Yeah.
McKinsey writes things every day about a company culture and selecting
Yeah.
for the factors that make it work. Why doesn't that transfer to conversations about immigration?
I mean, I think part of it is that people are worried about very bad outcomes, right? They're worried that people will look at some of those around us and say, "Wow, okay, some people are making the team better, and some people are making the team worse. And what should I think about these people who are making the team worse?" Um, and you could imagine there have been over history very hostile, evil reactions to people who are considered by society or by large portions of society to be making things worse, right? That's how you get pogroms, right? And people tend to are much more willing to engage in horrific violence against the outgroup. So one of the good cultural norms that people have settled on in rich countries is let's define everybody in the country as in group. And so we're not going to other anybody. We're not going to say we're basically all going to follow the Lake Wobegon rule of saying that all the children are above average. And that's going to help us sort of get along. And it's maybe a noble lie that's worth telling. So perhaps the best critique that one could make of my book is that, I mean, I've actually heard it said by, I've had it said by one person I'm thinking of in particular, who I respect intellectually, and who said to me, maybe what you're saying in the book is true, but maybe you just shouldn't say it.
Right. I mean, I guess the flip side is it's like okay, it's the noble lie works as a mechanism for social cohesion once everybody's here, but then you sort of extrapolate it outwards and it's like, well, if everybody's exactly the same, then they're exactly the same, and we should treat our acceptance processes the same, I suppose. It's I was sort of like trying to it's almost like trying to finish the quote in my head. It's like, yes, it makes sense. I asked people this too. It's like, yes, it makes sense that Harvard is very selective, but when it comes to immigration, and then fill in the blank. And like, what's the charitable ending to that sentence? Like, the people who wouldn't necessarily agree with you, how would they end that sentence? I struggle with it. Like, how would they end that sentence in a way that,
The,
how would
the
Brian
standard
Kaplan end that sentence?
story, the standard story is that there is no known mechanism. So among people who believe in open borders, their standard story is that they know of no mechanism by which immigrants could actually make things worse. They can think of plenty of ways in which they can make it better, but they literally no possibility enters their mind of a way in which a new person entering the national team could make things worse. Sometimes they kick the tires a little bit on the data and they try to look around and say, well, maybe, look, I'm not persuaded by the methods they use. I think they engage in some poor statistical thinking, but in general, they wall off theoretical arguments for how new people can make things worse. In other words, they're rejecting all of that McKinsey consulting, Harvard admissions criteria wisdom. And second, to the extent they do test things, they tend to say, we looked around, we couldn't find any evidence that migrants make things worse on average. I will point to an example. I do think this is a field where political correctness absolutely drives the scholarly literature. So the only place in research you're going to find, or you're likely to find evidence that migrants make things worse is when migrants are a member of outgroup. And so it's no surprise that there's a was a well-received study that came out a couple of years ago that showed that when former Confederates moved to the West and the Midwest of the US, they actually made things worse. They created a culture transplant, and they brought their evil ideas to the new places they moved to and tended to create more institutions of racial oppression. So that's a case where immigrants definitely made things worse. Academics were comfortable publishing that because, well, it's taking on outgroup. You're saying that outgroup was bad. And of course, these were terrible people. Personally, I wish that California could have found a way to make sure that former Confederates didn't move there, because the place I grew up wouldn't have been as racist.
Right. Yeah. And then nobody would object if you said, for example, like, Westerners go to, the colonial period, whatever it is, and they overwrite native cultures and they substitute their own cultures for like nobody would find that claim objectionable as something.
No. Yeah. Happen, so it's really about whose ox is getting gored here. Right. So, people should realize this is an area where political correctness or wokeness, whatever one wants to call it, really drives the willingness of researchers to work in the area. So you have to look for sort of in unusual places for evidence. And like I said, this Confederate Diaspora research, which has gotten a lot of mainstream attention, is one place to notice. Is just a reminder that, well, if it's happening there where you're allowed to talk about it, maybe at least a little bit of it's happening in places you're not allowed to talk about.
I still come, I still come back to the point. I'm trying to think of the best way to tee it up, but like, look, I mean, I guess maybe just talk about social cohesion for a second. Talk about the Rwandan flour makers, like or whatever you want to call them, but they were flour, right? I mean, I think I have that study correct, right?
Oh yes, it's not Rwanda, that's Kenya. So I did write a book review that was about Rwanda, but yeah. So that is that's not. I'm going to get the name wrong right here. Yeah. So there was a nice study of Kenyan flour makers. So there's a lot of academic research into whether, like within business teams, whether ethnic diversity or age diversity or what kinds of diversity are a strength and which might be a weakness. The problem is, of course, is that as you know, companies don't just hire people at random. So we don't get the true randomized control trials that you'd hope for when you're trying to learn about something really important. So it turns out that there's a Kenyan flour maker, a company that processed raw flours and bundled them for delivery overseas, right? So you're taking fresh flours, you're cutting them, you're sorting them, you're assembling them into bouquets or some sort of group, and then shipping them off overseas, right? This is a massive business operation. And a researcher found, this was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which by any measure is a top 5 journal. This researcher found that at this firm, there were 2 major ethnic groups that were the sources of employment in these flour processing factories. And the workers truly were randomly matched. And there were basically 2 people who would work together, and then they would have a manager. So it's basically 3 people working together on a team at high speed, taking flours, processing them, bundling them, sending them off to the next stage. And what the researchers found was that when 2 members of different ethnic groups were randomly assigned, they were less productive. So basically, each ethnic group was equally productive on average. So 2 members, let's call them Group A and Group B, since I don't have the names quite right in front of me right now. So if 2 Group A's are put together, say they produce 50 bundles of flours an hour. 2 members of Group B together, 50 bundles of flours an hour. So both groups equally productive. But when you put each of them together, when you put a Group A and a Group B together on the same team, they would be like, say, 5 to 7% less productive. And so it's a case where diversity was definitely not a strength. The ethnic conflict that had been longstanding in Kenya between these 2 large groups, that led to less productivity on the ground.
And it's just the mere fact, so it's not even putting the first question or the first issue, which come back to is sort of, there are, let's call it, qualitative differences towards outcomes that we would call prosperity or prosperous. But even all things being equal in that regard, even if they're equally good at cooperating, equally high trust, the mere fact that they're different in other ways and other dimensions seems to cause some headwinds, for lack of a...
Yes. And in the research, it's a study that went over the course of many years. And during part of that period, there happened to be a massive electoral dispute, claims of electoral fraud that led to violence in the cities. And then because it was an inter-ethnic group conflict, that made it harder for the groups to get along. And so productivity with diverse teams fell even more then. So that's just another double check that it wasn't a fluke in the data. And so this is just a reminder, of course, human beings find a lot of things to hate each other over, right? There can be religious diversity, gender diversity, ethnic diversity, and all of these things, of course, have caused massive conflicts that have made it hard for people to get along with each other, right? This is just another one. I tend to emphasize that in rich countries today, ethnic conflict seems like less of a direct threat to me from my estimates of the numbers compared to other issues that I care about in terms of cultural transplant theory. The gap between high savings rate countries and low savings rate countries matters a lot more to me for a nation's long run future than the question of ethnically homogeneous versus ethnically diverse countries.
Right.
So
For ethnic
at least among the rich countries that we're familiar with, right? So, but it
right,
is
and I guess
but we definitely have to give up on this idea that that ethnic diversity is a clear strength. I think that deserves at least 3 question marks after it.
Right. And the rejoinder is okay, right? Again, going back to the American experience, because this is, I think, probably the most common in some ways the most common sense and a fairly strong rebuttal is like, we're a nation of immigrants. This is not, although we did just, the foreign-born share of the population is now higher than the past peak, which was about 100 years ago, and like we did have a period of sectarian violence, but all these different ethnic groups did in fact learn how to get along prosperously and peacefully, right? Like, it's actually a fun random walk fact that I don't know if you know this, but do you know where and with whom the largest single day lynching in the United States was?
It was the one in was it Oklahoma?
No. So
Was it the racial riots where whites killed African Americans there? Is that right?
No, I could be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure actually it was in New Orleans, and it was it was Sicilians who were lynched by the Irish because the Sicilians probably killed an Irish patrolman. And then there was a large single day lynching of Sicilians in New Orleans, which incidentally has one of the second largest shares of Sicilian populations in the country outside of like New York, New Jersey. Little known, fascinating. But the point is like, so they clearly didn't get along at first. Daniel Day-Lewis, Leonardo DiCaprio, we've all seen it. That's pretty much how it happened. But they did learn how to get along. Right? I mean, I think that's a fair estimation. It just took some time.
I'm just looking up these numbers since we're talking. Yeah. 1891 New Orleans lynchings. 11 Italian Americans. That's a big number. The Tulsa race massacre might unfortunately be worse than that, although estimates differ. So a low end estimate is
a single day. I mean, it's an odd competition anyway.
You're right. It's a 2 day long. You're right. That's true. Yeah. I mean, it's a horrifying competition. So yeah, depending on the estimates, one believes one or the other could be worse. Yeah. But in terms of if you were looking at per day in particular.
But everybody knows about the Tulsa race riots. Very few people know about the Irish.
Yes, it sounds very So yeah, this reminder that some of these ethnic disturbances can come and go over time, but human beings look for horrible focal points, and apparently they're pretty good at finding them. Of course, it's worth reminding when people say that America's done a great job of integrating, assimilating, and welcoming migrants and handling all this ethnic diversity. Of course, when people are doing that, they're almost always, at least initially, leaving out the experience of African Americans, right? Who were like, yes, despite an important effort by the radical Republicans after the Civil War, there was nothing like institutional equality until after 1964, right? 65, and then also, as some of my GMU colleagues are careful to point out, many of the restrictions on Chinese Americans remained on the books for an extremely long time. And so in the West, Chinese Americans were kept in an important second class status in important legal ways for a very long time. So like a lot of this romanticization of the American immigration experience is about, wow, look, the English people managed to finally get along with Germans and Italians and Poles. Good for them. And I mean, that's great. I mean, don't get me wrong.
Yeah. They used to fight a lot.
America got a C or a D on a lot of other groups and an F on some extremely important ones for well over a century.
Do you does Soul's Ethnic America, does that sort of sit in the back of your head, or is that not on point?
I don't think that Soul's work on immigrant assimilation has taken into account the modern research on this. I think we've learned a lot that really deserves to be in the minds of anyone who thinks of themselves as conservative or libertarian, and of course the broader intellectual public more generally. I think the culture transplant literature is something that really deserves to be top of mind for people talking about the nature and causes of group differences. We can learn a lot from compared to when Soul wrote those kinds of books. We have a lot more cross-country data now, right? We can look at how things are in Mexico and compare that to Mexican Americans today. We can look at things in Italy and compare those to Italian Americans today. The rise of cross-country data means we can actually check directly to see if there are culture transplants, and the answer is usually yes. Not always, but usually.
So okay, that's a good segue. So there's a concept. All right, so part of the premise is obviously that there are cultural differences. They do endure, and to the extent they have qualitative effects on the things that we care about, whether it's prosperity or the conditions that allow for prosperity, or trust, thoughts around government or government intervention, savings rates, things like that, they matter. And you have this metric, you call it the SAT, that sort of tries to score for these things, as the migration adjusted SAT. So what is that?
Well, two great researchers at Brown, Potterman and Weil, kept track of who has moved where since 1500. And when possible, they did genetic double checks to make sure that the numbers were about right, to basically get a sense of, in percentage terms, what percentage of Americans today are of African descent versus of Native American descent versus European versus Asian, right? And the same has been done for Brazil. Japan, of course, is a country that has almost no in-migration since 1500. So it's easy for that. Estimating their numbers pretty easy. And so they kept track of what they call the migration matrix of who moved where. They, in addition, kept track of two measures of what are now called deep roots measures of before 1500. For how long in each region of the world had people lived under organized states? That's S. And for how many thousands of years had their ancestors practiced settled agriculture? That's A. A later team of researchers, most famously Bill Easterly, he's the celebrity of the group, created something that I call the Tech History Score, T, which measures, among other things, in the year 1500, what fraction of the world's technology were you using? And which version of it? Like, were you using the advanced version or the baby version? So were you using printed presses? Were you using the wheel? Were you using writing to communicate over long distances, things like that? And so together, those are the SAT score. You can do a simple average, but if you're trying to predict how things are in a nation today, you really want to use the T, the Tech History Score. How things were going in 1500 in a region of the world does a really great job predicting how the descendants of those people are doing today. So that is the Tech History Score. Basically, not much has changed since the year 1500 economically in terms of rank order across the world once you adjust for migration.
And just for context, so originally, I mean, what a lot of these studies, maybe I got this wrong, I was just sort of reading it from your book, but like what researchers were set out to do is they were trying to understand what predicts present day prosperity, right? Like, they were
exactly,
different factor analysis, right? Looking at different, whether it's, if a place had access to technology 500 years ago, is that predictive of present day success, or all of these different things? And I guess maybe just to restate the argument is that it does, provided you adjust for migration. So it's not whether that specific, like the United States of America, for example, obviously had basically no technology in the 15th century, relative to its prosperity today. But the people who are here now, where they came from, they did, right? That's kind of what you mean by migration adjusted.
Yeah. So the history, as others say in the literature, the history of peoples matters more than the history of places. If you're trying to predict, how rich a place is in the Americas, both North and South, you'll do a very good job if you take account of the fact that both the very furthest part of North America and the very furthest part of South America both had a lot of European migrants. So Chile,
Right.
Argentina, Uruguay,
Sorry, one
all
second.
countries. Sure.
I have a child intervention. I'm in the. Sorry about that.
No, that's
Go ahead.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, within the Americas, you'll do a better job predicting how prosperous it is if you take account of who moved where. Before Columbus, the richest places were close to the equator. Since Columbus, the richest places are further from the equator. You get the similar story across Southeast Asia. If you want to predict how rich a place is across Southeast Asia, unless a place has oil, the best thing you're going to do to predict prosperity is percent of Chinese ancestry. That's going to help you do a pretty good job predicting things. Singapore up at the top.
Should China import more Chinese?
Yeah. That's the thing, is that like these communism seems to be this really messed up institutional thing that kind of can curse a country for many, many decades. I hope it doesn't turn out to be centuries. There's something sticky about that thing, right? North Korea versus South Korea, right?
But doesn't that sound like selection effects then? It's like it's the Chinese who were chased away well, no, right? I mean,
it's possible the best people left, and it's possible the best people left Europe and came to the Americas too, right? That could explain part of, I mean, I'd like to imagine that part of the reason immigrants to America of many ethnicities have done so great on average is because we're really selective. Like, we made it hard to get here and only the best want to come here. And so that selection is certainly a feature. But that doesn't, but what the deep roots literature shows you is they say, look at how China was doing in 1500. It was like just right at the frontier. And I think most people can agree that if the other side had won the Chinese Civil War and it had been the group we call the Taiwanese now, the KMT had won, like, they would have been a couple of decades ahead on their path to capitalism, and they wouldn't look like this weird outlier. So this one accident of history maybe it's more than an accident, but the communists winning meant that China today doesn't look like Taiwan. And if things had turned out better, it would. So,
right. And that sort of begs a different question, which is, maybe too much agreeability and cooperation at the tail makes you, puts you at risk for some disagreeability. I think, in other words, the time when they lost, right?
You can get predated upon, maybe like like a small group of predators can just take over whole. I mean, it's a possibility worth thinking about. Somebody should test it. Yeah.
But so I want to pick on the SAT score a little bit. And again, the SAT is state agricultural technology, and so you give this. It's just you give this example of Argentina early on in the book. And I'll probably mangle it, but the idea. Why don't you tell it so that I don't mangle it?
Yeah. So I pull this out as sort of almost a parable. As a parable, I say, imagine a country that's doing really great and it wants to grow faster, and it's run by these people who are pretty much capitalist, and so they decide to welcome a lot of immigrants to come in to be agricultural laborers. And they bring in people from a pretty poor country, and these immigrants come in and they bring a whole bunch of like very radical left-wing ideas, and especially their children do. And the country hadn't had these very radical left-wing ideas in the public discourse, but then this, especially with the second generation of migrants, that gets really becomes a big part of the public discourse. And there's a big battle ultimately that stretches out over decades between the old elites and the new elites, and they kind of come up with a fusion because things are usually meeting in the middle. And this new fusionist leader brings some of the bad ideas and some of the old ideas and some messed up militarism and brings it all into takes this great country that was absolutely at the economic frontier and turns it into just a global economic also-ran. Apparently because they fused these old crummy economic ideas with whatever was going on before. And I say, this is the story of Argentina. And in the plotted history, if you take it at that 50,000 foot level, it fits the facts. The Argentinian elites, if you read mainstream history, the Argentinian elites thought we'll bring in a docile, submissive workforce and they won't change anything. They hoped that these new migrants would go out to the countryside and keep quiet. Instead, a lot of them moved to the cities and created political protests. Their protesters tended to be Italians who were bringing anarchist and socialist ideas that were really hot in the late 1800s. So it's a particular time and place story. But it is a reminder that migrants can come in and change your
So
politics.
basically, Argentina. So I mean, to sort of make the short, like Argentina, I'm going to simplify. Argentina was great, but they imported a bunch of communists and anarchists from Italy and Spain, and then things went a little
Yeah, that's a short version.
But like
Yeah, happily
Italy and
ever after.
Spain, yeah. But Italy and Spain, I'm just looking at the big table. Like Italy and Spain have
They're pretty
high
good
SAT
countries
scores,
overall,
Like
right?
in other words, if you were, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So then, how does that? Is that like, yeah?
I'm not a
Algeria
man
has
of one
it's
model.
a higher SAT score than the United States. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm not a man of one
So
model. There are a lot of over the course of the book, I work out a lot of different culture transplants. I work through the history of a lot of different culture transplants. The SAT score is like one nice, really robust one, but doggone it, it only explains like 2/3 of the data, right? So I'm a big believer in letting 1,000 flowers bloom. So there's more than one way for migration can change a culture. And so what I'm a big fan of doing is saying, here is the big generalization that you should always keep in your head. But you should remember that the underlying principle is that migrants on average can make the countries they move to, they can carry something from their old country to their new one. In this case, in the case of Argentina, according to mainstream historians, the one thing those particular migrants brought was a temporary, extremely passionate love of anarchism and other left-wing ideas. Yeah. That's not something that's going to happen all the time, right? These fads come and go. Yeah. It happened in the U.S. too. It's just that I think they got swamped out there, right? Yeah. The Sacco and Vanzetti.
Some of them got deported. Yeah. But also, the New Deal was a fairly transformational, political, economic, was more communist, more whatever you want to call it, than the status quo ante, right? I mean, it did change.
And we actually have recent research showing, again, this is another sort of nuance on the SAT scores thing. It's a reminder that SAT scores aren't everything. There's recent research showing that European migrants who came from countries that had the beginnings of welfare states were more likely to support something like the New Deal. So when the U.S. push for a stronger safety net was building up, it was migrants who came from Europe, recent migrants from Europe who came from countries that had welfare states that tended to push for that. So we imported ideology. And it's again a particular time and place argument. But if you have a bunch of people come in from a country where they take, say, family leave or transgender rights or the right to abortion for granted, it's pretty likely that that's going to persist into the second generation among those migrants in your country. And they'll push for it politically.
Reading something a few months ago, like now blanking on where it was or what, but the gist of it was, was looking at the mid 19th century German exodus from Germany to the United States, and like that, who was being selected for in terms of who was coming here, deeply affected sort of politics in the United States, for the next 60, 70 years at least.
Yes.
It's certainly in the parts of the country where I live, like in New Jersey, where you can sort of see some of that legacy, where you have the street names are all very Dutch, from the 17th century, but then like a lot of the cultural artifacts and cultural institutions are very German, at least from 100 years ago. It's kind of interesting. But okay, so I thought you were going to push harder on the SAT, but the other point I was going to make, and maybe I shouldn't dwell too long on it, is like you have these charts. There's two of them at least, one on page 70, one on page 50, and they're basically, one of them plots, governance indicators along a migration adjusted SAT, and the other one plots income per capita, against the migration adjusted SAT score, and it shows obviously there's substantial grouping in the upper right quadrant that, sort of the higher your SAT score, the better the governance, more income per capita. But I guess the counterpoint is the relationship is very not linear, right? It does seem to be, kind of most of the distribution runs towards the bottom, and then at the very far end of the SAT score is where all of the extreme gains are, to whether it's to governance or income per capita.
Now that's a case where I say that publication norm shape things. If I had done that the way the original researchers did, which is if the y-axis is a log scale or a ratio scale, then it looks like a nice straight line. So as most relationships in macro, when it comes to some trait on the x-axis and income per person on the y-axis, those relationships are exponential. And so the way we usually show them, so basically 1 unit of whatever thing you're measuring gets you a certain percentage change in output, not a certain dollar change in output. And this is the way education works, right? A rule of thumb estimate is that 1 year of education gets you 9% more income, right? Not $900 more income, but 9%. So that compounds out as you go out, right? Just for the audience.
Yeah.
And so if you drew that income graph as a log, which is what we would do in an academic article, then it just looks like a straight line. Similarly, that's part of the reason why I think with the governance indicators one, it's closer to a straight line because with a lot of noise around it, of course, because that's the way the world works. But with the governance indicators, you're seeing something more like a straight line. Yeah. So our relationships in real life are log linear in macro most of the time. And I've had editors tell me, we just shouldn't put log units on a y-axis before. We shouldn't put log units in a book. So only if it's the books for PhDs.
Got it. All right. Well, I thought I had a good question there, but actually that makes more sense.
Yeah, that's the truth, right? I think that's what's really going on. So yeah.
I'm gonna keep peppering you though with objections. So
yeah.
All right. The other thing I think that immediately jumps to mind, this is something that sort of bringing things forward a little bit, and I think about a lot. It's like, some of the most economically vibrant places in the country right now are places like Florida, Texas. Some places with some of the highest foreign-born share. They're not the same. I mean, but Texas has an extremely, a large share of foreign-born of Mexican and second-generation Mexicans, and also other Central Americans, and those have fairly low SAT scores. But in terms of at least directionally, both stocks and flows, Texas and Florida are, they're doing great, relatively speaking.
Yeah, they are fantastic places. Yeah, I'd be happy to live in either of them. Yeah.
And so, I mean, isn't that so? Shouldn't we be doing more of it? Or
That's a great question. So the response that I believe the most, like my first thing to answer, is that in America, the institutions are national. And so our productivity is built under national institutions. So even if you see a firm in New York, that firm in New York is operating, has to obey a lot of things that are part of the United States Code. Many lawsuits that could possibly happen to that company, even if they start off in a state court, can get appealed to a federal court. So basically, the United States is run under, since the Civil War, thank God, the U.S. is overwhelmingly a system where the rules of the game are made at a national level. That's obviously formally so. In the case of United States Code, many, many laws and regulations, interstate commerce rules, environmental rules, for the vast majority of environmental rules. So the and I think that the institutions, the legal rules of the game, are crucial in shaping a nation's productivity. And I think the people help shape those national institutions. That's my first stage of this. And I think my second stage is that even for a firm that's in New York, even for a firm that's in California, Florida, Texas, a lot of the financing, a lot of the key management decisions will be shaped by basically financial elites within the U.S. who have, who are pretty sharp overall. I can turn to IQ or education as a way to think about that. But I do think that once you have the rules of the game set up in a fairly clear and transparent way, at the national level, like there is a lot to be said for the merits and the joys of low-skilled labor as a way of getting things done. Yeah, once you set the rules of the game at the national level, go to town finding a lot of affordable labor. That should be a new term that people should use more, affordable labor. And get things done using smart people organizing the processes who are good at cooperation, and then they can have it run out at scale by people with less skill, people who might be newer to the country, people who might be newer to the language. They can ramp up and get you the benefits of those massive returns to scale.
It's funny though. I mean, because it's sort of again, I'm going to push you on it, but it's almost like it's the it's the flip side, right? And in other words, like one thing that we clearly know, or maybe we don't, maybe we just got it wrong, is like, why can't we export our own culture more easily? Like, why can't we we tried this, right? We gave the US Constitution to the Iraqis and we said, here's our secret sauce. Now you do it. It's done. Now, go forth,
Yeah, yeah,
live long and prosper. It didn't work, right?
yeah.
It's de
First,
Tocqueville stuff, right? It's not the piece of paper, it's not the words, it's not the laws, it's something else, I would think.
yeah.
Yeah.
Personnel. I mean,
Um,
like they say in politics, personnel is policy.
Yeah. But it
So
seems like there's a kind of midpoint where you can if you can hardwire things in at a supranational level or a federal level, and it gives you more leeway at the federal. Or maybe we just haven't, maybe we haven't let the experiment play out.
yeah, I mean, it's
So
been tough to come up with. I mean, it's not. I can't say it's impossible, but it's just been difficult to implant great institutions in a place without personnel who come from Western Europe, East Asia, or some of their offshoots.
yeah, it's interesting. So I guess like like in terms of like what are we? Okay, bringing us to the ground. I'm sort of trying to challenge the theory in a few different ways, and I think it's interesting. I was sort of like trying to think on the fly a little bit more, but I want to fast forward a little bit, almost to the present. Um, like so what? Like one question is just like, okay, so this goes back to some of your other books, but like in the point around social cohesion is like, is this, do we expect the democracy to work better or worse, or, going forward? Like, is this what are some of the trade-offs going forward? Whether
Well,
it's,
like
yeah,
I think America's going to have some struggles with its new and rising levels of diversity. Like I've said this before, that the way we can sum up the two political parties now as a rough approximation is that the entire pre-1964 U.S. electorate is now smushed into the Republican Party. So that's basically whites disproportionately without college degrees, and then a little bit of everybody else, right? That's the
yeah,
Republican Party.
And older white
And
people.
older folks too, yeah.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I mean, this time around, the elderly are kind of doing a little better for Biden. So like I saw it in the last couple of weeks. You might want to check it out.
Yeah, I haven't checked.
And the Democratic Party is basically the entire post 1964 electorate, right? Highly educated women, college educated folks, both men and women to a high extent, and then African Americans who weren't allowed to vote before, and then all the new arrivals. So the Democratic Party is the post-64 America. The Republican Party is the pre-64 America. And both of those are really diverse coalitions, right? So within each of those coalitions, they're tough coalitions to manage.
Yeah, I think we've seen that.
Yes. So there used to be a time when it looked like the Democrats were having a tougher time negotiating. Obviously, since the rise of Trump, the Republicans have had a tougher time doing their intra-group negotiations. But it's going to go back and forth. But that sort of within group bargaining cost that's much higher than it used to be. And I think a lot of that's for good reasons. And having a highly educated elite that sort of lords it over the rest of your country, that worked okay when the college educated group was a small part of the electorate. Just that alone, having them going from being, say, I don't know, 5-10% of the electorate to being, say, a quarter plus of the electorate, that by itself is a big change, because college, does create some cultural changes, some more cosmopolitan tastes that are make it tough to work out negotiations with the rest of your coalition. That's enough of a tax, of negotiation tax. There's going to be a lot of difficult negotiations going on in highly ethnically diverse countries, and then educational diversity just adds to that.
I mean, is that an argument that we should be less democratic going forward? I mean, for the I mean, I'm not trying to be provocative. I understand it's a provocative question, but like, you think of like, yeah.
I mean, I think
the
that
imperial
in the 20th,
models did diversity pretty well, right? Like you can import small productive minorities under the protection of the king, and they did okay.
And as long as the king is in the mood to keep an eye to protect them out of his own self-interest, that works okay, right? Which is maybe most of the time, but then once a century or two, you're like, oh God, horrors.
Yeah.
So I do think that over the course of the late 20th century and early 21st, we did romanticize democracy too much, and democracy representative democracy should be seen more as checking in on an independent state from time to time, rather than thinking that the elected representatives who are 2 blocks away from me over here, I live on the Hill, rather than thinking that they're supposed to be actually actively managing things. I do think that what we've done with the Supreme Court and the Fed, that should be multiplied to a few more parts of government, where you just let those folks autonomously do their job. They have very long terms, and then you check in on them time to time, yell at them on social media. Politicians can yell at them on social media, but make it very hard to kick them out.
But I mean, yeah, it's a, you know, it does. Yeah, I don't want to go down too many of those paths, but there is that sort of like subcurrent of when everybody's arguing about who's pro democracy. It's really, you know, who's pro my, you know, a lot of the pro democracy arguments are in fact not democracy pure. They're actually sort of inversions of, it's more, you know, we need to make sure that we protect our way of life. They're very conservative cultural sounding arguments.
Yeah, and
not entirely democratic.
Yeah, and you know, there's a lot of blurring of lines between democratic decisions and protection of rights, where, of course, as the founding fathers knew, majority rule is pretty bad for minority rights as a rule, right? So it's not really your starting point.
Yeah.
So we should be thinking about how do we build governance systems that lead to good outcomes that create human flourishing. That's what I tend to think. I don't think democracy is an end in itself. I don't think the process is so beautiful that we should have people celebrating it as an end in itself. I think that it should be used as a tool to create good outcomes. And I think we can. I think there are important benefits of democracy. Democracies don't kill their own citizens very often. Democracies don't let their citizens starve very often. Those are both really great outcomes. So having at least a small dose of democracy is really important for good governance, but we want to keep the dose at the right level. There's a Goldilocks point. We're probably beyond it.
Yeah. So what do we do now, right? I mean, if the argument is that, like, okay, we have to sort of somewhat take it as a given that people are going to bring their cultures with them, and that we have a very large share of other cultures who even within that share are fairly diverse. It's not like we, you know, all of the so-called foreign-born nationals are from the same place. They're from many different places. So what do we do now? I mean, I guess one question is like, you know, do you think the culture wars are somewhat misplaced? In other words, is part of the argument here actually that, like, look, you can try to assimilate, you can sort of try to fight over what mainstream culture is, but it's kind of irrelevant. The die has been cast. That's sort of one question. And if that's not true, then I don't know, what ought we be doing, I guess, to help weather whatever the trade-offs might be. I mean, I think in the end, you wrote, you know, lower quality government, less trust, more social conflict, right? Those are the things that we ought to be expecting.
Yeah, and I do think that we can. A country can choose an immigration policy to make themselves better. I mean, every time a country is bringing in immigrants, they should be. I think on average, we should be asking: are these people going to make? Are they better than us? You should be trying to bring in people who are better than you. You should be trying to bring in people who are better voters than average, who have higher savings rates than average, who have higher levels of education than average, and you should be using whatever statistical indicators you have at your disposal to predict those things. That's why I think points-based systems are the way to go, because a points-based system isn't about saying I'm betting it all on one number, and you have to get above 1,400 on your SAT before you're allowed to come into this country, right? I'm not a man of one number. So points-based systems.
Should we give people a Big Five personality test?
So this is a question that should be studied a lot more. The Big Five, conscientiousness of the Big Five personality traits, that's the one that does predict a lot of good outcomes. It doesn't predict as much as IQ does in terms of predicting good life outcomes, but it's pretty darn good. You know, I don't want to, you know, I could artisanally say, well, gosh, I'd love to have a lot of people come in who are low neuroticism, but I can't actually say that that's really bad, right? I know from the research that it's reasonable to argue that some level of disagreeableness is actually good, right?
We have a shortage of accountants too. Like, you know, we need people who are a little neurotic around the edges.
And where are we going to get our stand-up comedians, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
So if we want to be really evidence-based, right? Suppose you wanted to go with individual factors, right? At the individual level, you'd be like, I want to use some measure of education or test scores. I don't care if you use an IQ test or an SAT score. Just use whatever fig leaf you need, right?
Yeah.
I don't have a great object. We know that personality tests can be faked. So we just want to pick things that are hard to fake, right? And that's why I
Yeah.
think something like the savings rate in the country you come from works pretty good as a points-based system, right? You can't fake your country's savings rate. So these
Doesn't
national
China have a
indicators,
very high savings rate?
yeah, it does. Yeah, it's been high for a long time. Yeah.
But
And the
nonetheless, it's a
East
good
Asian
predictor of.
countries, beg pardon?
Sorry, I think there's a little lag. But nonetheless, having a large share of Chinese migrants, right, is a good predictor of prosperity, right?
Yeah, prosperity. Yeah, exactly. The East Asian countries, their offshoots in Southeast Asia, they tend to have high savings rates too. This is something that the CBO in a study noted quite a long time ago. There's sort of a mystery intercept shift for countries of East Asian origin, which extends to Southeast Asia. So this is so that's just one indicator. I would welcome further research to basically come up with arguments for rigorously using some other national indicators of prosperity. But I mean, we can already look and tell that on average, migrants from some countries tend to be more successful than migrants from other countries in the second generation. And we should be looking for ways to use individual traits and nation level traits together to boost the chances of success and to bring in folks who are going to vote for better stuff and make America better 50 years from now.
Yeah. Is there a country? I guess two questions. I guess, is there a country you think that does it well? That's like a good model for to learn from or to borrow from?
Until recently, I would have said Canada, right? They really had a great points-based system. So
Yeah.
I do think a lot of, for quite a while, Australia, New Zealand, these guys had really good points-based systems. Japan's new points-based system seems to work quite well. I think these are all systems that are well worth emulating and at least thinking about as a starting point. Any of these sort of merit-based, points-based systems are kind of handy. And, I know that a little bit of mystery meat is going to go into any of these systems because they get created through a political process, right?
Sure.
But I think that the points-based systems we've seen in the real world are robust enough that that even adding in a little bit of politically driven plus factors, saying, oh, we want to give union members a little bit of a plus factor, or we want to give people who are nurses a plus factor. These little things that could be arguable on their own. That's fine. If you find some way to get an individual measure of human capital and some national measure of good institutions, low corruption, you're in the right path.
Is there somewhere that you're watching or somewhere that is either like this is a good test to see if I'm right or wrong, like Canada maybe as an example, like, is your prediction, I guess, Canada's GDP per capita will go down, or like Sweden, right? Sweden is trying to do some repatriation, I think, if I remember that correctly. Are these models that you're looking at and saying, this is what I think will happen? Is there some good test that will play out over the next 10 years?
This is a great question because, I should try to find ways to make my theories testable, right? I shouldn't just say oh, my theory is so perfect. My ideas are so great.
But it's testable, the thing is, somebody might be wrong. You don't want to be that.
Yeah, I don't want to let my theory be testable. No. The real problem is that for testing it is that very few countries are making any changes that are substantial, right? You're talking about moving 1-2% of the population. You're not going to be able to detect that single that out from noise, right? You're not going to pull out the signal from the noise there. So
Canada's had some pretty substantial changes over a fairly short period of time, and it's a much smaller country than ours. But
now that's I mean, if we're talking 10 to 20% changes and we're waiting 50 years, then I should be willing to bet some money on that, right? So if we're talking 2 to 3% changes, which is more likely the range we're seeing, then it's going to be tough to test. And that's why looking at these micro level indicators and hoping that a future generation of researchers tries to do more of these studies like the Confederate Diaspora study, where you look at a group who moves and checks to see how the politics turn out, or the crime rates turn out, or the voting patterns turn out. These kind of checks, that micro level stuff, can often take the place of the macro stuff we never get to test.
Okay, in the few minutes we have left, I want to ask, not necessarily random questions, but just jump around a little bit. So you refer to the 3 books that you've written as the Singapore trilogy. Why is that?
Yes. Well, it's because Singapore is a country with a lot of lessons for us to draw from. And all 3 of my books have a role for Singapore. Singapore is a country that does exceptionally well on standardized test scores, whether you call them IQ scores or math and science scores. That's the heart of my first book, Hive Mind. And it's actually Singapore is the first country that I name in that book. In my second book, 10% Less Democracy, Singapore is a country that's actually 50% less democracy compared to the rich frontier countries. But it's a model of how technocracy with some degree of citizen participation can achieve really excellent outcomes in a short period of time. And then the third book, The Culture Transplant, Singapore is sort of this exemplar of how a Chinese diaspora can create an economic miracle and can basically bear fruit that shows that the Ming Dynasty's excellence in the 1400s was no accident. And they can carry the deep roots from their old country to a new homeland and show a form of excellence that's, beyond compare. So each of these books has a role for Singapore, and they show different ways in which intelligence, a little bit less democracy, and the Chinese diaspora can change a country's future.
What has Singapore done poorly, or what could they do better?
That's a great question. I'm always in favor of finding ways to treat your guest workers better, but I haven't studied that in enough depth to have any concrete advice. And since so many of their guest workers are basically repeat customers coming back on one contract after another, that kind of repeat business is a pretty strong signal. They're doing a lot pretty well right now. I was just there last week to give a talk, and I can say the one thing that I wish they had better was better Uber bikes. So the little rental bikes there are just very tiny and inexpensive. I wish they're a rich enough country and they punish their criminals hard enough that they could actually afford to put better bikes out there.
That's right. You have this quote, which I really like for a lot of reasons, which I can't get into just, in the time that we have from the, I think the last conversations with Tyler that you did about this sort of, you have this unique perspective on American exceptionalism. I'm just going to read it so you don't have to remember it, but, it's a quote, a sense of adventure that is central to the American experience. You could think of it as being a pioneer. It's a mixture of pioneering spirit with an element of strong social capital. So to me, or to you, the Mormons are the embodiment of this. They have strong social capital, strong enough to stand up against other people, but at the same time willing to take huge risks and endure great persecution in order to build a new world. And that's sort of an extreme version of what Americans have done for quite some time. And it's a rare blend of social capital and adventurousness at its best times. That I think it's a great quote, and sort of the pioneering adventure spirit. I think is something that is sort of important in all of these stories, right? It's runs through some of these immigrant stories, but also through the entire the American concept. Do you think, is there some modern, like, are we missing that? Do we have it somewhere else? Like, is it in venture capital? Is it in some other country? Like, or do we just not have it? Is that yeah?
Yeah, I think in percentage terms it has declined. I think that basically there's something in the American spirit, that high adventure and high openness and high risk taking, that is not quite as prominent as it used to be, and that's part of the reasons to have a sort of a strong high skilled immigration program, because that tends to select for people who have those kind of traits. Because people coming to America know that, people who are skilled who come to America, they know that if they make it, there's a chance that they make it at a very high level that would have been almost unimaginable back home, right? And so finding ways to import that adventurousness, that high openness, that high degree of risk taking is really well worth doing, I think. Tyler's right that he wrote a book called The Complacent Class, where he talked about how Americans have just kind of become softer and lazier over time, kind of like in Rocky 3, Rocky 4 type thing, right? So you're rich and you're posh and you're like, you don't need that much anymore. The fire's gone out. You need something to bring you back. Hoping that Americans can bring it back on their own is too much of a dream, I think. I think importing that sense of adventure is the right path going forward.
Should we, are our certain talent, are New York and San Francisco, are they hoarding talent? Should we force people to, like, take these little groups of pioneer groups and just send them to the frontier, send them to West Virginia or something, or send them to the Midwest. I don't know.
See, that's the case where do I think that there'd be too much social contagion going on? Would they just become like the other folks in the new place they moved to? It's a version of what I call spaghetti theory. You kind of become like the place you moved to. You think they're going to change you, and you end up changing them. So, I mean, what I'd really prefer is to see New York and San Francisco just scale up, right? I want to see New York start building a lot more land again, out into the rivers, and increase their surface area by like a third over the next 20 years and just start building a lot more. I mean, there are certain places and times where there are increasing returns to having people in one place. And it's not everywhere, but San Francisco for the last few decades and New York for well over a century have been those places. So scaling them up is better than trying to just invent a new one from scratch.
I'm just like sort of fascinated by the idea of helicopter dropping, high groups of high quality human capital into, on the frontier. I mean, like,
it would be a ton of fun, right? I mean, our land grant universities are a version of that, right? And obviously, if I thought that we could build up some great engineering schools in some of these new places, I'd be in favor of something like that. But still,
just pay people,
it's like MIT and Caltech. They're the places where a lot happens. So
and they have huge network effects, and actually, and they get away with a lot of bad governance, right? That we've seen that because it's so hard for people to select out of it. This is great. Covered a lot. I did, I sort of many more things that I could talk about. I guess one last question, because we did touch about it very quickly, but so we have been staring. This is sort of comes back to the immigration problem, but like we've been getting older as a nation for years. We've known about it for years, right? We could forecast the Medicare or Medicaid, Social Security problem that have been coming. Because question one is just like, why do you think we did such a bad job preparing for it? And question two, I mean, isn't that the solution that we've chosen? Like, certainly that's what Europe has chosen. I mean, isn't that functionally what this comes down to? We didn't make enough grandkids to pay for the entitlements that we gifted ourselves, whatever, 60 years ago. So now it's growth by acqui-hire, as I like to call it. Isn't that what's happening? And what alternative do we have?
I mean, I don't know if it's that intentional, right? So, I mean, it's not as though the migrants who've been coming in over the last few years. I mean, certainly we're going to get a lot of people who can work in the healthcare system, right?
Sure.
But, if you're thinking about, are we getting the immediate flow of RNs and technical nurses and MDs from that process? No, that's not happening. You are in the U.S. case, because the U.S. has such a stingy welfare state, the U.S. will do okay making a lot of profit off of these new migrants, right? Having folks who, at least especially in the second generation, bring in more revenue than they cost. But, it would have been better if we just brought in folks who bring in a lot more revenue than they cost. So a better immigration system would have brought in people who cost very little and who just make a ton of money, so they pay a lot of taxes. If you were basically, focused on trying to save the welfare state, the safety net for the elderly in America, you would be focusing on bringing in a lot of rich folks and who would pay for a lot. And then the government could easily be able to hire enough workers from wherever in the economy to do whatever else they were doing and switch over to working in healthcare, take care of the elderly.
So we should have just brought the rest of Europe over. It's just like, foreclosed on them. And
well, as long as you can get the top 20%, then it's a pretty good case for that.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah,
but you're right. But the European, the fact that Japan didn't plan for it very well either, and that's another indicator. Like, they, in terms of aging, they're demographically ahead of us, right? And we're looking around the world.
Sure.
So there's a certain cowardice to all of this, and part of this is driven by the fact that these countries are democracies, and the old voted high rates. So it's going to be very difficult to cut out benefits for the poor, cut benefits for the elderly. The better shot, unfortunately, is going to be some kind of cuts to the poor. So that's something that the elderly, most of whom are affluent, can be willing to support.
Yeah, one of my many unpopular opinions that I like to say when I get a rise out of people is, there should be a voting cutoff age too. Just like you can't vote until you're 18, and then you lose the right to vote when you get to, I don't know, name your age. I only half mean that. But it's
worth thinking about.
Economy problem.
Well, if you only half mean it, you could just give them half votes. So
There you go. Yeah. I like the fractional vote system. We should go back to that. That worked great. Yeah. Okay, this was great. I'm going to. I appreciate it. I'm going to stop the recording. And let's. Do you have any other final thoughts you want to get in before I cut it off? I give you.
No, this is great, but I will brag. I will say that just today I learned that my book, The Culture Transplant, was translated into Japanese and was released. I was wondering when it was going to
So
happen,
cool.
but it's now available in Japanese. So your Japanese listeners are welcome to go and buy that. And also, since the my last biography was written, I am now professor of economics here at George Mason. I'm very grateful for
Oh,
the
nice.
gift of promotion that my colleagues voted for me.
Well, congratulations. Those were both great.
Thanks
And
very
you should
much.
get
Yeah.
the dust cover changed if it's not already.
Yeah, I'll get that changed in the next
Okay.
edition. Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna